evening. My name is Joseph David Cress, history and education reporter with the Sentinel newspaper here in Carlisle. I'm also the author of 10 books, including 4 books in a series I call World War II Memories. 3 of the 4 books have been published, and their cover designs are on this slide. The 4th book is in production and should be out within the next 4 months. Life is a journey down many paths that define who we are. Generations ago, men and women from across the United States answered a call to serve at a critical time when the country needed them most. World War II became their journey, their path to an adventure of a lifetime. For many, it was their first time away from home, yet they braved the uncertainty. They left behind the familiar to step out into the unknown with mixed emotions of fear, excitement, and hope. The war took them to exotic, far-flung places where they learned to live life to the fullest, knowing death was always with them. Combat tested and transformed them. Struggle pulled and tugged at them until they were not quite the same again. Every witness to World War II carries around experiences as emotional baggage. Each perspective unique, they build upon the collective narrative of a war that delved into every ocean and reached into every corner of the globe. Tonight you will meet 9 World War II veterans. You will see their faces. You will hear their stories. And hopefully, you will remember them. Since Memorial Day is next Monday, I want to briefly touch on our current situation using statistics drawn from the National World War II Museum. In 1945, there were 16 million World War II veterans living stateside on occupation duty overseas. As of September 30th, 2021, there are an estimated 240,929 World War II veterans left in the entire country, including about 13,833 in Pennsylvania. Currently, these veterans are dying at a rate of roughly 234 per day. It is projected that by the end of this year, there will be less than 135,000 survivors. That's a loss of approximately 106,000 men and women, or the equivalent of about 7 World War II U.S. Army infantry divisions. The last of the survivors will leave us by the 2030s. One of those veterans who passed away was my grandfather, who served in the Army. Two family members inspired me to write this series on World War II memories. This photo was taken in June 1945 at Camp Landing, Florida, where my grandfather, Paul John Cress, the big guy leaning on the vehicle, served stateside as a mechanic. The little guy standing on the bumper is my dad, Paul Robert Cress. A Navy veteran, my dad worked for over 30 years as a certified nursing assistant at the VA Medical Center in Lebanon, my hometown. Upon retiring, Paul Robert Cress was a volunteer coordinator who managed a fleet of shuttle vans that transported veterans from outlying counties to Lebanon for treatment and appointments. One day my dad shared a memory with me from his time as a CNA. He told me of a common practice up in the wards where staff members cared for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. When they knew a veteran was about to die, they would keep a vigil over the person. They would hold the person's hand to reassure the dying that he or she was not alone in the room. Knowing my dad was involved in this inspired me to collect the memories of World War II veterans. Unfortunately, my grandfather passed away before I launched this initiative, so I never had the chance to collect his war stories. My dad is still around. He's in his early 80s. December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. As a journalist, I have interviewed hundreds of people over the course of my almost 32-year career. There are only a few that I would consider famous. Joseph Lockhart stands out because he appears in the history books as an ordinary Army private caught up in extraordinary events. I actually had the honor of talking to him twice. The first time I interviewed Mr. Lockhart was in late November 1991, just prior to the 50th anniversary of the raid on Pearl Harbor. He was a retired engineer who lived outside Harrisburg. I was working at the Sun newspaper in Hummelstown. The second interview was in December 2006, while I was working for the Sentinel in Carlisle. I'm not going to read an excerpt from the Sentinel story that I included in my book, World War II Memories, Peril in the Pacific. The raid showed up as one enormous blip on the electric horizon at 7:02 a.m., a very broad pulse on the primitive early warning radar. Private Joseph Lockhart was amazed to see the contact rapidly approach 132 miles out, coming ever close to Oahu and its military bases. I checked the equipment. It all seemed to work correctly. I had to assume there was something out there, he recalled. I knew by the speed they were planes. They marched right at us. Technology saw the formation of aircraft as a single object bearing down on its position atop a volcanic ridge. Lockhart tracked the echo as George Elliott worked the plot table, trying to predict course and speed on what should have been an uneventful Sunday morning. Elliott reported the contact, but was told not to worry by a young lieutenant, Kermit Tyler, on duty at the Singapore Information Center. It was now about 7:08 a.m., December 7th, 1941. The question Lockhart still asks himself today is what would have happened if the Japanese had launched their strike on Pearl Harbor just an hour earlier, when all 6 mobile radar units were turned on, sweeping the horizon around the island during a training exercise which concluded at 7 a.m. History is strange and loaded with coincidence. On that long ago morning, Lockhart figured Elliott was new and could use some extra training. So why not continue to run the radar post at Opana Point? Besides, the truck assigned to return to the base was running late that day of infamy. Only 19 at the time, Lockhart never expected to be a footnote in the history books. Hindsight is always 20/20, Lockhart says. With the time we had, about the only thing we could have done was move some planes and man the guns on the ships. Nothing could have stopped the inevitable ruin. 20 miles out, the blip was lost in the clutter of the signal reflected off the land. The first bombs fell at 7:55 a.m. The first 6 months of World War II in the Pacific were the darkest and most desperate days for the U.S. and our allies. The Empire of Japan dominated this theater of operations, conquering Wake Island, Guam, Malaysia, the East Indies, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. The U.S. Navy blended the advance with the Battle of Coral Sea and turned the tide of the war with the Battle of Midway. In August 1942, the U.S. launched an amphibious assault on Guadalcanal, the first in a series of island-hopping operations that gradually carried our forces across the ocean. This brings us to Stuart Kynes, a Harrisburg native who was a student majoring in hotel management at Penn State University when he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve after Pearl Harbor. He entered the service with the expectation that he would stay in college and then become active duty upon graduating. Instead, he was called to duty halfway through a semester and went through Officer Kennedy School. Kynes was a second lieutenant when he was deployed to the Pacific. I'll now read a story from my latest book, World War II Memories, Win Through to Victory. Stuart Kynes knew right away it was a dirty trick when the girl in her late teens to early 20s emerged from the cave. Naked from the waist up, she wore a skirt and sarong around her lower parts and covered her breasts with her hands. Naturally, this drew the attention of men who had not seen a female in weeks. One or two began to approach, even though Kynes had warned them to stay back. Sure enough, the girl removed her hands, exposing her breasts and the live grenade she carried concealed in either palm. She lobbed the explosives at them, but died in the exchange of fire between the Marines and the enemy soldiers, who used the distraction as an opportunity to set up a machine gun at the cave mouth. The Japanese were dirty fighters in more ways than one, Kynes said. My guys didn't get hurt, but they could have been killed. The enemy shot at them, but missed. Once she pulled out the grenades, they hit the deck fast. It was spring 1943. Kynes was in command of a flamethrower unit tasked with clearing out caves in the hills of North Guadalcanal. We were brought in by request to act as exterminators, mopping up pockets of enemy resistance. On a typical mission, they would hike several miles from base camp, sleep in the jungle, and assault several caves in 1 to 2 days. The fighting was small scale, against only a few Japanese, but the risk was no less intense. Each time the Marines had to battle through a bare rocky patch of ground to reach a cave carved into a hillside just above the tree line. A common tactic was to get in close enough to shoot a plume of flame near the front of the cave to douse the rock with a superheated gel of gasoline. This made it too hot for the enemy to set up a machine gun or rifle position. Once closer, a Marine would fire another blast of flame directly into the cave, burning alive any human being trapped inside the enclosure. But the danger did not end there. The Japanese were masters at digging elaborate tunnels and cave complexes. The Marines had to enter each cave and shine a flashlight around to make sure that everyone was dead. At the slightest hint of movement, a Marine would leap on the enemy soldier before the man could turn over to attack. We always had to be careful, Kynes said. You never knew what we were going to get run into. The typical cave began as a big open space that narrowed the deeper you went. The crawl space led to 3 to 4 rooms that sometimes interconnect with other tunnels. Every so often, the Marines found the Japanese soldier alive and ready to surrender. Most of the time, they found only boxes of food and ammunition. 2 years later, Kynes was among the Marines who invaded Okinawa on April 1st, 1945. There he was wounded in action. After the war, Kynes returned to Penn State University for graduate work in hotel management. During his career, Kynes worked for hotel chains, managing properties throughout the country. When he died on March 23rd, 2015, at age 94, he was survived by 3 daughters, a son, and 8 grandchildren. As U.S. forces advanced across the Pacific, the Western Allies defeated Germany in North Africa before conquering Sicily. That campaign served as the launch point for an assault on Italy and the opportunity to open up a second front on the European continent. Since June 1941, the Germans have been fighting a brutal war on the Eastern Front against the Red Army forces. One goal of Italy, and later the invasion of France, was to draw German forces away to the south and the west in order to speed the Russian advance and the eventual demise of the Third Reich. We turn our attention to Robert Otto and his first experience with combat in the skies over northwest France, early in the morning of June 6, 1944. This year marks the 78th anniversary of Operation Overlord, the combined airborne and amphibious assault on Normandy. A Carlisle native, Otto was a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne Division. I will now read an excerpt from the story, A Strange Air of Beauty, from my book, War II Memories, The Great Crusade in Europe. Peering through the clouds surrounding Otto could see the invasion fleet as dark shapes plowing through the English Channel. Every soldier on the transport plane was eager to get the night jump into France and over with. There was almost complete silence, but no noticeable tension among the men. Most of them slept, while others just sat and waited, deep in thought. The formation of aircraft approached the drop zone by an inland route from the east, only to be spotted by the enemy. It seemed the whole German army had just opened fire, Otto recalled. The enemy aircraft had a strange air of beauty about it. Tracer rounds streaked the ebony sky, peppered here and there by flak bursts. Fragments of red-hot metal hit the fuselage, bursting through in a couple places. The plane shuddered from the explosions. When the red light came on, Otto stood up to ready himself for the jump. Not knowing what to expect on landing, he chambered around in his M1 carbine and switched on to safety as the plane came in low over the horizon. He was the second man out the door when the green light came on. The jump had to be made from 400 feet or less, Otto recalled. His parachute swayed back and forth, once, twice, a third time before he hit the ground. He landed hard in a pasture but was not injured. Cows were out grazing in the moonlight, a sure sign the field had not been mined or booby-trapped. I landed by myself in a field surrounded by 15-foot-high hedgerows, Otto said. It must have taken me a half an hour to get my chute off. At least it seemed that long. I tugged at the straps for a couple of minutes and peered through the darkness to see if anyone was watching me. The place was alive with Germans, and one could almost be beside you on the other side of the hedgerow. I pulled at the parachute again, trying to get it unbuckled. In desperation, I cut the thing off with my knife. For a period of time, Otto lay sprawled in a ditch along a hedgerow to take in his surroundings and figure out his location based on a map he had in his possession. It looked as though he missed the target by at least 3 miles. So he had to do some walking in hostile territory. I was tripping my way through the woods in the darkness, stumbling all over the place, Otto recalled. When I heard a challenge barked out, I thought it was the end. It was so dark. I was against the bayonet before I knew it was another one of our men. As we met up with other fellows, it was like a whole new company. I never found any of the fellows from my own plane. Later that day, Otto was severely wounded when a German artillery shell exploded nearby. At one point, Otto was thought dead, but he woke up long enough to see a Catholic priest administer last rites. D-Day was his only combat jump. Is everyone hearing me okay? Am I good? Okay. By late December 1944, the Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and had raced across France into the Low Countries and the western frontier of Germany. Adolf Hitler had a choice. He could commit his strategic reserve to the Eastern Front to slow the Red Army advance, or take a gamble and launch a winter offensive in the West to split the Western Allies in the hope that they could bring them to the peace table. Hitler rolled the dice in what later became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle of the war for the U.S. Army. We turn our attention to John Otto, older brother of Robert Otto, and a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. John had more experience with combat jumps in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. He was wounded in action during Operation Market Garden, a combined airborne and land assault in Holland to seize bridges over the Rhine River. John Otto returned to duty in time to participate in the Battle of the Bulge. I will now read an excerpt from the story, Triple Insurance, that appears in the third book in the series, World War II Memories, Sentimental Journeys. Shaping the plastic explosive numbed his fingers and sapped the warmth from his hands, John Otto had to work quickly and quietly under the cover of night to set the charges to cut the support beams of the metal bridge. He was worried he would freeze to the same structure he was ordered to destroy. His feet were soaking wet as his legs dangled down from beneath the span and dipped into the icy waters of a stream caught in the grip of winter. The day before, the battalion commander had ordered Otto to finish the job started by the 307th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 82nd Airborne Division. Specialists from that unit succeeded only in blowing off the wooden deck, leaving the bridge supports intact for the enemy to use. All the Germans had to do was lay new timber over the 9 I-beams, or stringers, that spanned the gap between the 2 concrete platforms jetting out from either shore. That first night, Otto sneaked up to the edge of the woods to closely examine the bridge from the cover of the trees. He had to estimate the amount of explosive needed for the job. The bridge was in this wide valley over a stream, and on the other side was a very large hill, he recalled. There was a road somewhere behind the hill, and they could hear the German trucks, tracked vehicles, and motorcycles moving down the road. We knew they were there. Maybe they didn't know where we were. The next evening, Otto returned to the bridge with 2 men carrying 6 satchel charges of plastic explosive. Each man had to plant 2 charges on 3 stringers to cut the metal at different lengths to weaken the bridge. The stream had swelled since the night before, so they couldn't sit on the beams without getting their feet wet. To plant a charge, they first had to remove the explosive from the satchel and take it out of its wrapper. They then had to mold it into shape using body heat to compact it. Otto figured they lost 25 to 30% of the explosive because parts of it crumbled and fell away from their fingertips. The men wired each charge with 3 fuses as triple insurance. Everything was brought to a centralized location where Otto rigged the plunger to trigger the explosion. He included something extra to cover their escape. When the plunger was pushed, a white phosphorus grenade flew into the air and exploded, followed by a second grenade closer to the ground. The 2 grenades left behind a dense cloud of smoke, enabling them to leave without incident. We froze our asses off, but we got the job done, Otto said. John Otto returned to the U.S. in 1946 and stayed in the active duty Army a total of 23 years before retiring in 1961 as a lieutenant colonel. He then worked another 33 years with the federal government as a civilian intelligence specialist for the Department of Defense. He retired from government service in 1994 and died on January 13th, 2016 in Butler, Pennsylvania. entering the Pacific, U.S. forces continued the strategy where certain islands were invaded, while others were bypassed, isolated and starved out. This brings us to George Mixel, an orphan turned jungle fighter with the Bushmasters in New Guinea. I will now read an excerpt from the story Strike One, Strike Two, which is from World War II Memories, Peril in the Pacific. In spring 1944, near Wapta, New Guinea, George Mixel was assigned the task of helping another soldier load crates of ammunition onto a jeep for transport back to the front line. They arrived at the supply dump around 2 p.m. A short time later, an artillery shell exploded in the jungle, the equivalent of several city blocks away. I heard the whoosh of the shell and saw a puff of smoke, Mixel recalled. When a second shell landed about a block away, Mixel realized an enemy artillery piece, miles up the coast, was zeroing in on his position. They were probably watching the area with binoculars, he said. They knew we were after something important. They wanted to destroy it. They were not after me or the other man. We just happened to be there at the time. Mixel gave a warning, only to end up alone in the line of fire. I had turned my back to pick up a crate. When I turned around, I was surprised to see him drive down the dirt road away from the beach. I understood. He was only trying to protect the ammunition. Maybe he expected me to jump into the back of the Jeep. He was about 100 yards away when the third shell hit. Training kicked in as Mixel jumped behind a thick tree root, propped himself off the ground on his hands and toes, arched his back, and shouted at the top of his lungs. This odd exercise was his only chance to avoid being injured by the waves of concussion that washed over him and through the ground following the explosion. Keeping his belly off the ground prevented his stomach and lungs from being ruptured by the blast pressure, while shouting relieved the strain on his eardrums by equalizing the force. It only partially helped. While his abdomen was spared trauma, his ears were not. In the decades that followed, Mixel was suffering from a persistent, high-pitched ringing. Though the tree root protected him from shrapnel, Mixel was still in danger. The last shell hit the supply dump and set the remaining crates on fire. Bullets exploded as the heat cooked off the ammunition, sending fragments of metal flying through the air like a hive of angry bees. Mixel had to run through all that to escape. With no ride, he walked 7 miles back to the front line, wondering the whole time if a Japanese sniper would take a pot shot at him. Instead, Mixel spotted 3 enemy soldiers approaching the headquarters bunker. I saw them only yards away, sneaking through the jungle growth. I stopped dead in my tracks. One spotted me and fired. The bullet came so close to my head, I could hear the whistle only inches away, he remembered. Other Americans saw the Japanese and managed to kill them all, but one GI took a bullet to the chest near a major artery around the heart. With every beat, blood spurted out of the wound. Medics took the man away on a stretcher, but Mixel never heard whether the soldier survived. George Mixel was honorably discharged from the Army on June 24th, 1945. He returned to central Pennsylvania, where he worked with the New Cumberland Army Depot, and retired as a storekeeper after 34 years. When Mixel died on March 4th, 2019, he was survived by his son, a daughter-in-law, 3 grandsons, and 2 great-grandchildren. From the start, the Pacific War saw the extensive use of aircraft carriers, as the main offensive naval weapon of the U.S. and Japan. One of the men I interviewed was Robert Hench, a retired auto mechanic who lived in Carlisle. During World War II, he was a crewman on board the USS Bataan, a light aircraft carrier assigned to Task Force 58, the main strike force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet during the closing stages of the war. It was at this time that the Japanese used suicide planes to crash into U.S. Navy ships. Carriers were a prime target of what became known as the kamikaze, or divine wind. I'll now read an excerpt from my book, World War II Memories, Peril in the Pacific. Too scared to even think, Robert Hench could only watch in horror as a suicide pilot took aim at the flight deck of the USS Bataan. Hench knew once the enemy began his death dive, there was no chance for the pilot to miss, unless the anti-aircraft barrage knocked the kamikaze out of the sky. It was April 17th, 1945, and the Judy dive bomber had started its attack with a bomb that missed an escort. The pilot pressed on towards the Bataan, skimming the ocean just above the wave tops as he drew closer to where Hench stood on the portside catwalk. It was so close to us. I never heard it, but I saw it come in. 5 seconds and it was over. A common tactic of kamikaze pilots was to try to hit one ship with a bomb and then crash dive on another. That way they could damage 2 vessels. Another tactic was to approach at very low altitude. Anti-aircraft guns can only bear so low, Hench explained. If it's too low to the horizon, you risk hitting a friendly ship. You were not supposed to fire that low, but in the excitement and confusion, the gunner got carried away and kept on firing as he tracked the target down. Hench watched as the plane made a loop to pull up for a steep dive on the flight deck. But just as it was about to hit, the Bataan dodged out of the way. The skipper put the ship in a hard turn. That's why it missed us, Hench said. One advantage we had was the Bataan was built on a cruiser hull. Speed and maneuverability counted in the kamikaze attack. We were very fortunate that day. Hench wrote the close call in his war diary. He, the enemy pilot, just missed my GQ station, landing single platform by about 15 feet. And boy, was I scared. When he hit, there was an explosion, and pieces of the plane going in all directions. I saw the wheel flying up in the air, past me about 30 to 40 feet. Hench could also see the pilot's body from the waist up bob out of the cockpit. Near as he could figure, the flight harness must have severed the man cleanly in half upon impact, ejecting the head, arms, and upper torso as the plane blew up. What remained of the pilot sank to a watery grave with the rest of the dive bomber. It was frightening to watch the kamikaze come over the task force in waves. The anti-aircraft fire was so heavy, the sky was just black, Hench recalled. There was so much fire, it covered the whole task force in smoke. You were a sitting duck, especially the carriers. That was their main target. To put a ship out of commission, kamikaze pilots aim for the central elevator on a carrier, the base of the bridge on larger ships, and any place between the bridge and midship of a smaller warship or transport. Sometimes friendly fire from excited gunners proved just as lethal. The same day the dive bomber narrowly missed the Bataan, a 5-inch shell from a nearby destroyer struck the carrier, killing one man and wounding another. Early victories in the Pacific War resulted in tens of thousands of Allied prisoners. The steady advance of American forces prompted the Japanese to relocate these captives further from the front line to the home islands where they became slave laborers. We turn our attention to Raymond Harper, a Michigan native who was captured during the fall of Corregidor in early May 1942. On October 1st, 1944, Raymond was one of 1,100 prisoners loaded into the cargo hold of a freighter. As you will soon hear, there's a good reason why these prison vessels were known as hell ships. I will now read excerpts from the story Harlemeroo from my upcoming book, World War II Memories, Win Through to Victory. Raymond Harper was one of several hundred men crammed into a steel compartment coated on the bottom with coal dust and horse manure. With the sun beating down, temperatures peaked at over 100 degrees in a metal box with little ventilation and no sanitation. Conditions were so cramped, it was standing room only, and prisoners could not sit or lay down. Pushing and shoving was commonplace as desperate men slowly went crazy. Harper suspects there were even a few murders. It was uncanny. It was bedlam, Harper recalled. During the day, sunlight came in through the opening. At night, there was no light at all. Only moaning, crying, whimpering, yelling, and cursing. Men already sick with tropical diseases were dying most every day, while others felt like animals in competition for precious resources. Once daily, the Japanese lowered a couple buckets of water or wet rice from a small hatch on top of steel ladder. You maybe get a canteen cup. That was all you got for the day if you were lucky, Harper said. The situation was awful, with guys avoiding bloody feces all the time. The crew would give us a 5-gallon bucket to pass around. The body got so dehydrated, there was very little capacity more. Once the bucket tipped over and spilled the contents all over the guys standing below, the whole thing came back down. It was indescribable. Harper noticed how there were wooden planks attached to the frame of the ship to tie the cargo down. He was able to climb up and sit with his legs dangling between the hole and the boards. It was a small comfort for Harper to be perched 8 to 9 feet above the tangle of humanity simmering below. The air was a little bit better up there, he recalled. I couldn't stand to be down there with that crowd. There was nothing to do. Just hang there and wait and hope to get something to drink and eat. Part of the time, Harper lingered in a stupor, sleeping off and on. He turned to scripture for guidance when there was enough light to read his Bible. Once he prayed, a torpedo from an American submarine would hit the ship and bring all this misery to an abrupt and violent end. Often, Japanese prison ships did display the Red Cross as required by the Geneva Convention. As a result, many were sunk by Allied aircraft and submarines, unaware that their targets were carrying their own countrymen. One day a torpedo either hit the Harlemeroo and failed to explode, or sank another ship nearby. Harper said the shockwave was like being hit by a hammer. The Harlemeroo spent 21 days at sea, dodging American air and submarine patrols on a journey first to Hong Kong, then to the port city of Takao, on the southern coast of Formosa, present-day Taiwan. While at Hong Kong Harbor, the POWs were subjected to an impromptu shower to wash away days of filth. They brought us out on deck and turned saltwater hoses on us to clean us off, Harper recalled. We had dead bodies piled up near the fantail. I counted 40 dead. They hauled them out of the hold and piled them on the stern. I have no idea what the Japanese did with the bodies, whether they just dumped them overboard. Hell ship. That was putting it mildly. Raymond Harper survived the hell ship and disembarked on Formosa, where he was transferred to a rest camp. The Japanese wanted him and the surviving prisoners to be healthy enough to work as slave labor. Months later, on August 15, 1945, Harper was in the lunchroom of a factory outside Tokyo when the radio stopped playing military music and a voice came over the airwaves. Harper did not know it at the time, but the voice was that of Emperor Hirohito, telling the Japanese people that they had just surrendered. All he knew was that Japanese workers around him became very sullen and withdrawn. They just shrank away. Meanwhile, in Europe, the U.S. Army Air Force was engaged in a strategic air offensive against targets throughout Hitler's Third Reich. Constant Maffei served as a flight engineer on B-24 Liberator bombers flying out of Italy. I'll now read you excerpts from the story, Was It Us? From World War II Memories, Sentimental Journeys. Constant Maffei could tell if a man was a B-24 pilot just by looking at his left arm. It was twice as large as the right arm because extra strength was needed to hold the wheel in place as the pilot worked the throttle controls with the right hand. At 23,000 feet, the pilot would fly for 10 minutes, then the co-pilot would fly for 10 minutes, Maffei said. I used to be between them, wiping the sweat off their brows from flying that aircraft. They had to hold it in formation and not run into the guy in front of us. Accidents and near fatal close calls were inevitable in the confusion of battle. The flak would push your plane all around, Maffei said. One time, he was in an aircraft that had strained underneath another B-24 that had just opened its bomb bay doors. Fortunately, the top turret runner spotted the hazard and came over the intercom yelling out to the pilot, Sir, the planes are going to drop their bombs directly on top of us. The pilot adjusted course just in time to avert disaster. Once over Vienna, we got knocked out of formation and dropped 20,000 feet, Maffei recalled. The left inboard engine was knocked out by flak. Another 88mm shell exploded near our wing and turned us almost upside down. We went down sideways. I was up against the ceiling. The pilot and co-pilot were reluctant like hell, trying to pull it back and get it out of the slide. As they started to pull out, I was down on the floor. At about 5,000 feet, we pulled out of that. But we still had our bombs. Our bomb bay doors were open. I got between the pilot and co-pilot, and the pilot said, dump the bombs. I hit the toggle switch. By the time the bomber had crossed the Alps and reached the Adriatic Sea, Maffei knew it lacked fuel to reach Italy. So he recommended an emergency landing on the island of Vis off the coast of Yugoslavia. Originally a Royal Air Force fighter base, it was little more than a runway with 1 or 2 hangars. Thank God we didn't have any of our hydraulic systems shot out, Maffei said. We had to break the stop at the end of the runway because there was a mountain. There was scattered wreckage from planes that hit the rock face and exploded with their crews. Being a flight engineer, I went with the plane and the mechanics they had there to get the engines running, Maffei said. We stayed overnight, just slept in the plane. They filled us with enough fuel to get back to base. But they were in for a surprise when we landed around 2 p.m. The guys from the day before reported they saw us getting hit out of formation, Maffei said. They never saw any parachutes. They marked us down as killed in action. They went to our tent and packed all our personal belongings to get ready to ship to our families. We had to put up our tent again. We had to get our stuff back. They thought we had all died, that we had crashed. Word came over the radio that during a raid on Vienna, an American bomber got knocked out of the sky and accidentally dropped its bombs on the wrong target, killing 160 civilians. 38 years later, we had our first squadron reunion, Matthew said. We saw each other and started crying. The first thing our nose gunner wanted to know was whether we had killed those 160 people. It had haunted him for 38 years. I didn't know whether it was us. I had no idea where we toggled the bombs, just it was not over water. We had to unload those 8 500-pound bombs. In the immediate post-war years, Constant Matthew worked in the family locksmith shop. He married his wife, Alfra, on February 9th, 1947. And together they had 5 sons and 3 daughters. 3 sons became military officers, while 2 daughters married officers. I'm the only enlisted man, Matthew joked during his interview for my book. During his career, he mastered the profession and started his own specialty locksmithing enterprise. Matthew was almost 98 when he died on January 5th, 2021. Aside from his wife and children, he was survived by 33 grandchildren and 48 great-grandchildren. We finish up with William Wayne Trent, who during the war served as a sergeant assigned to a machine gun squad with the 272nd Infantry Regiment, 69th Infantry Division. On Easter Sunday, 1945, Trent enjoyed an impromptu holiday meal along the Rhine River, where his squad kept vigil over anything suspicious floating downstream. But days later, Trent was not at all cool or collected. I'll now read an excerpt from the story Panic Attack, which is from the book World War II Memories, The Great Crusade in Europe. Something snapped inside William Wayne Trent that terrible day he walked into Kessel, Germany, and left his unit behind. Panic came over him on seeing the dead GI, compelling him to throw away his pistol and rush down a street choked with debris. Having walked 26 miles, Trent and his men were exhausted when they entered the city outskirts and witnessed the devastation. When I got into Kessel, I saw real damage for the first time, Trent recalled. I'd seen many houses bombed out and burned, but Kessel was a large city. And according to statistics, 95% of it was bombed to destruction. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't have some livable space in their basements, perhaps where the debris formed little cavities where they could survive. But it was such a massive destruction. I couldn't believe my eyes. Walking down the street, he encountered a different kind of horror. We came upon an American tank that had been hit, Trent said. The turret had been sheared off at the turret line, probably by the impact of an 88mm shell. Nearby was the upper half of an American soldier, his torso sliced cleanly at the belt line. There was no blood, just raw meat, with a purplish tint along the edge of the wound. The corpse had a bandolier strapped along the shoulder and across the chest, with 2 to 3 grenades tied to the straps. I never even saw his face, Trent recalled. The rest of him, I didn't know where the other half was. The lower torso and legs were probably still in the tank. The man must have been standing up inside the turret when the shell hit the vehicle. Seeing the mangled body triggered a primal fear. At that point, I just panicked, Trent recalled. I was a squad leader, and I just abandoned my squad, essentially. I don't remember where we were, but I started running. Where was I headed? I was headed east. Eventually, his men caught up with Trent as he sat down to compose himself. They relieved he had not been hurt. Trent had not encountered a single German, The whole time, he was in a panic. The 69th Infantry Division has the distinction of being the first American unit to link up with Red Army forces during the closing weeks of the war in Europe. The first book in the series, World War II Memories, The Great Crusade in Europe, includes this funny memory of the post-war occupation. The burly Red Army soldier knew he had to be properly medicated before treatment could begin. William Wayne Trent was in the dentist tent, waiting for an appointment the day the Russian came in holding his jaw. The man was roughly 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighed about 200 pounds. When he removed his hand, you could see his cheek was swollen, Trent said. He appeared to be in a lot of pain. The dental technician gestured to an examination chair before grabbing a pair of pliers. He was walking towards the Russian, intent on pulling out the bum tooth, when the big man waved his hands back and forth, crying out, "Nit, nit, vodka, vodka!" Clearly, the man wanted a dose of what passed for a painkiller in the Red Army. Though it took a while to fill that particular prescription, the Russian downed the half bottle of vodka in no time. He put it up and drank every bit of it, Trent recalled. That would have knocked me out right there. Instead, the big man just relaxed and lowered his guard enough for the technician to pull the tooth before asking the patient to rinse and spit some blood into the bowl. It was funny to watch that, Trent said, but I would have laughed in front of the Russian. They were so unpredictable. You never knew what they were going to do. From what Trent saw, Red Army soldiers were not just tough and hardy, but a loud and boisterous bunch, all too eager to party. The war was over. It was a time of rejoicing. It was natural for the survivors to celebrate at every opportunity the end of 4 years of fighting with Nazi Germany that claimed over 24 million lives in the Soviet Union. They even invited Americans to join in on the fun, though Trent never got involved. I saw them from a distance. Others were in the thick of it.